Fantasy football starts of the week for week 6. Kirk Cousins faces my Chicago Bears, who allow the most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this season, along with the second most passing yards per game. Cousins currently ranks number 1 in passing attempts, number 1 in completions, number 2 in passing yards, number 1 in passing touchdowns, and number 4 in fantasy points, aka he's having a good season. Justin Jefferson unfortunately hit the IR, but because of those metrics I just told you, along with the core of TJ Hawkinson, Jordan Addison, KJ Osborne, I think Cousins will be just fine in this matchup. Alvin Kamara faces the Texans, who allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to running backs. In Kamara's first game following his suspension in Week 4, he rushed the ball 11 times for 51 yards, but most importantly, he caught 13 of his 14 targets. He finished with 21.4 fantasy points. The very next week, he doubled his rushing attempts and finished with 80 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, along with 3 receptions for 18.7 fantasy points. So in a 2-game sample size, we have Alvin Kamara finishing as a top 10 fantasy running back in both of them. We also have Alvin Kamara running the ball at a high volume rate and also catching the ball at a high volume rate. It's a good matchup. He's hot. Make sure he's in your lineups. Raheem Mostert faces the Panthers, who allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 7th most rushing yards per game this season. The rookie who is on fire, A-Chain, unfortunately hit the IR. We might see Jeff Wilson Jr., who has been progressing, coming back from the IR, but it's going to be Raheem Mostert as the running back 1 in this great matchup. Mostert has had games of 121, 82, and 65 rushing yards. He's totaled 8 touchdowns this season so far. Mostert's snap percentage is going to go right back up, and I think he can continue to have fantasy success this week. DeAndre Swift faces the Jets, who allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 4th most rushing yards per game this season. If we look at the sample size of weeks 2 through 5, when DeAndre Swift took over as the lead back in Philadelphia, he ranked during that span number 5 in total fantasy points, number 3 in rushing yards, and number 7 in receptions. Swift has finished as a top 12 running back in 3 of his last 4 games, and has had games of 175 and 130 rushing yards. So fantasy consistency, along with a great matchup, makes DeAndre Swift a solid play this week. Calvin Ridley plays the Colts, who allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, along with the 5th most passing yards per game this season. Calvin Ridley already faced the Colts this season in Week 1, and in that game he caught 8 passes for 101 receiving yards and a touchdown for a season-high 24.1 fantasy points. Calvin Ridley, following Week 1, did cool off, but he came back to life last week, Week 5, where he caught 7 of his 8 targets for a season-high 122 receiving yards, another top 10 fantasy week. So I like Ridley in Week 6, coming off of a hot week, in a plus matchup, and in a matchup he has already excelled in. Ride the hot hand with DJ Moore, who faces the Vikings, who allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 11th most passing yards per game this season. The DJ Moore-Justin Fields connection has looked like one of the best connections in football the last 2 weeks. In Week 4, DJ Moore caught 8 of his 9 targets for 131 receiving yards and a touchdown for 27.1 fantasy points. He followed that up with a huge performance in Week 5, catching 8 of his 10 targets for 230 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns for 49 fantasy points. If we look strictly at the last 2 weeks, no wide receiver has had more receiving yards or more fantasy points than DJ Moore, who has a great matchup this week. Drake London faces the Commanders, who allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season and the 12th most passing yards per game. London is coming off of season highs in both targets with 9 and receiving yards with 78 from Week 5. Week 1, London opened up with some concerning volume, but after that he's had fairly consistent volume, 8, 6, 7, and 9 targets. I like London to build off of his solid Week 5 and have a positive performance in Week 6 in this plus matchup. And finally, earlier this week I told you to stream Logan Thomas. Now I'm saying he's a good start. The Falcons allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to tight ends this season. Logan Thomas is coming off of his best fantasy week, scoring 20.7 points last week. In Week 5, Thomas caught 9 of his 11 targets for 77 receiving yards and a touchdown. Back in Week 1, he had solid volume with 8 targets. Then he went on in week 2 to score a touchdown before he had to leave that game early with a concussion that held him out of week 3. It's clear that he has a good connection with Sam Howell. He has been the heaviest targeted player on the team in 2 games this season. So I'm liking Logan Thomas to stay hot in a really good matchup this week. Be sure you are following the Fantrax socials for consistent fantasy football content to help you guys win your matchups.